Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Exploring the U.S. Government's Recent Approach to China and its Relevance, and I think the word relevance is an understatement, to international banks. I'm Bridget Polachine, CEO of the IIB, and we're really pleased to have joining us today to lead this discussion a team of experts from Sidley and Austin, an IIB Associate Professional Member. This group has the perfect mix of experience: law enforcement, litigation, government affairs, and regulatory compliance to help us work our way through all the complexities and nuances around the relationship with China. Kicking off the webinar will be Tim Traynor, Global Co-Leader of Sidley's White Collar Criminal Defense and Investigations Practice. Tim's a former federal prosecutor and has been involved in some very significant cases in his public and private sector roles. Joining Tim will be his colleagues Michael Borden, who heads Sidley's Government Strategies Group, and prior to that, he was senior counsel to the House Financial Services Committee during the enactment of Dodd-Frank. Michael Mann, also a partner in Sidley's White Collar Government Litigation and Investigations Practice, and Barbara Broussard, who focuses her practice on international trade compliance, specifically customs and economic sanctions. As always, we want this webinar to be relevant to you, our members, so please ask questions by using the Q&A function on Zoom, or for those of you who have joined by phone, you can email questions to us at info@iib.org. Tim, we certainly appreciate you taking the time to be with us today and lead us on this important discussion. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Bridget. And thanks everybody for joining us today. I know we're coming up on the holidays, and for those of you in New York, we had quite a significant snowfall over the last 24 hours. I hope you've all dug out. We had a lot of laughs around my house today because my kids are remote schooling and they got a snow day, and we were sort of perplexed at how that really could happen since they're already at home. Nevertheless, we continue our work here and wanted to spend a little time talking to you about U.S. government's approach to China and how that's relevant for international banks. We thought that now would be a good time, even though we're coming up on the holidays, we're coming up on the end of an administration and the beginning of a new administration, really because there is so much going on. You know, obviously the China policy has been a key aspect of the Trump administration. And a lot of activities that the Trump administration is engaged in has been of high relevance to banks. And in particular, as we get into the remaining days of the administration, there has been so much going on already that if you aren't paying attention, you could miss something. You know, even simply last week, we had the announcement of new sanctions. We had the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, the Foreign Financial Institutions Report was issued by OFAC. We had Congress passing the National Defense Authorization Act that's awaiting the president's signature. And that was, you know, all within a week. And I think for those of us, which really is all of us who've been paying attention to the Trump administration, we all know that there could easily be weeks that are more interesting and more busy than that ahead of us in the remaining 34 days of the administration. So we thought before everybody disappears for a holiday and some candy canes and eggnog, we thought that taking stock of where we are today would be a good idea. Certainly if once the Biden administration gets underway, we'd be happy to update folks on some of the developments there. So some of the key areas that we plan to cover today. First of all, we want to talk a little bit about the government's China initiative, the Department of Justice's China initiative, and efforts to obtain documents and transactional information from banks overseas, and that is in China and other jurisdictions as well. We also wanted to talk about some of the economic sanctions that have been imposed by the U.S. government relevant to China, and then finally give you some thoughts about the Trump administration, what could happen in the remaining month or so, and then some thoughts about the Biden administration going forward. So with that said, let's turn to law enforcement and demands for extraterritorial documents and transactional information. Mike Mann, get us started here by telling us a little bit about the DOJ's China initiative.
Sure, Tim. Thank you, everyone. So, as you may be aware, the DOJ's China initiative reflects what is perceived as the strategic priority of the Trump administration to counter what it perceives to be national security threats. The China initiative was launched in 2018, about 2 months before then Attorney General Jeff Sessions was fired from his job, but it remains in play today. And the initiative was launched against a background of some previous findings of the Trump administration that a combination of China's practices are viewed as unreasonable, including its outbound investment policies and sponsorship of unauthorized computer intrusions. So the DOJ has set a number of goals for the China initiative. They're public goals. Most of them are not particularly relevant to international banks, other than potentially how they may influence money laundering typologies to consider, given that there's an increased focus from U.S. law enforcement. But some of those priorities include trade secret theft cases, pursuing non-traditional collectors of information, such as university professors and researchers that have the potential to transfer U.S. technology to China, and also focused on supply chain threats, such as in the telecommunications sector as they relate to 5G, and pursuing corruption cases under the FCPA. But perhaps the most relevant DOJ priority for banks are DOJ's efforts to improve its ability to collect evidence in China. And that's primarily through what's known as the Mutual Legal Assistance Agreement with the United States. And more specifically of relevance to international banks is how the DOJ is increasing pressure on China to aggressively collect evidence from banks that operate in the United States. Tim, you're on mute.
Mike, so let's talk about some of the mechanisms that the Department of Justice has for collecting evidence overseas. You mentioned the Mutual Legal Assistance Agreement. Can you describe that agreement and give us a sense of how effective it has been or not been?
Sure. So the Mutual Legal Assistance Agreement is it's almost like what's known as a Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty, or an MLAT. But it's an agreement between the United States and China that goes back to the late 1990s. Practically speaking, it's not been very effective, except in cases where both the United States and China have a mutual interest in the relevant criminal conduct. And as I noted a few moments ago, a stated priority of the DOJ's China initiative has been to improve China's cooperation under the MLAA. And one way that we're seeing them achieve that goal of incentivizing China's cooperation is by more aggressive use of what's known as compulsory processes, such as subpoenas. So in addition to the MLAA, there's what's known as a Bank of Nova Scotia subpoena. And that's another way that the DOJ can seek evidence from banks overseas. So this type of subpoena, named after a case that would involve the Canadian Bank of Nova Scotia, it typically seeks bank records located abroad by serving the U.S. branch of the foreign bank with that subpoena. The authority of the U.S. government is to compel production of records in a foreign country, even when the production of those records would violate the foreign country's laws. And that was upheld in that case in the mid-1980s by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit. And in that case, it was a case where the DOJ sought bank records that were in the Cayman Islands by serving the Canadian bank's Miami branch. Since that decision in the mid-80s, courts have generally held that grand jury subpoenas for foreign bank records were permissible where they were deemed to be necessary to an overriding U.S. interest. And the third area to consider are what's known as subpoenas authorized under the Patriot Act, which gives the Attorney General through the Department of Justice or the Secretary of the Treasury through the Treasury Department the ability to subpoena records overseas if they're related to a correspondent account in the United States. And that includes records that are maintained outside of the United States relating to the deposit of funds into the foreign bank.
So, Mike, let's talk about the what's referred to frequently as the three Chinese banks subpoena case, which was decided by the D.C. Circuit last year, and it was based on the use by the Department of Justice of some of these methods to compel the production of evidence from China.
Sure. So this is a case from July of 2019 where the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia affirmed what's called a civil contempt order by a lower court against three Chinese banks for their failure to produce documents in response to DOJ subpoenas relating to an investigation of North Korea's financing of its nuclear weapons programs. The case stemmed from a December 2017 subpoenas that were served on the three Chinese banks, and it related to a Hong Kong-based front company for North Korean state-run entity. And the subpoenas demanded the production of certain records that were actually located in China. So things like signature cards, account statements, and other types of transaction information. And these were all for accounts related to this front company in Hong Kong. For two of the three banks, the DOJ utilized the Bank of Nova Scotia subpoena and served the subpoena on the bank's US branch. For the third bank, and by the way, we're not referencing the banks by name because it's not public, it's all sealed, so we don't know who the banks are, we just know that they are Chinese banks. But for the third Chinese banks, they did not even have a branch in the United States. And so the subpoena was issued to that bank pursuant to the U.S. Patriot Act provision that I referenced before, because they did have a correspondent relationship in the United States. So in November 2018, after the three banks failed to comply with the subpoenas, the DOJ filed a motion to compel compliance. And the banks fought that motion on several grounds, including that even if the court could exercise its jurisdiction over the banks, the court should not compel the production of the records because the production would violate Chinese law and expose the banks to fines and other types of legal penalties by the Chinese government if they actually complied with the subpoena and produced the documents. And the banks argued that the DOJ should utilize the process set forth in the MLAA, and even got the Chinese Ministry of Justice, who is responsible for handling MLAA requests in China, to submit letters to the court stating that it would timely review a request made through the MLAA process. But the DOJ countered, stating that the U.S. national security interests override the interest of China's bank secrecy laws, and that the MLAA process had proven to be really not workable whatsoever. So the the lower court sided with DOJ, held the three banks in contempt and ordered them to each pay $50,000 US for each day that they failed to comply with DOJ's subpoena for those China-based records. The three banks appealed to the circuit court in DC. And by the way, as you may be aware, the DC Circuit handles many money laundering cases because it's based in DC, where Main Justice is, and where DOJ brings many of its money laundering and forfeiture cases. But the Court of Appeals considered the arguments made in the lower court and concluded that not only was there personal jurisdiction over all three banks, because frankly, two of the banks consented to jurisdiction when they opened branches in the United States. The third bank, it found that its choice to maintain a correspondent account in the US was sufficient for jurisdiction. So the Court of Appeals also considered the comity concerns identified by the bank, which namely was compliance with that subpoena would put the banks in breach of Chinese law. And the Circuit Court felt that national security interests stated by the Department of Justice as it related to North Korean sanctions outweighed the concerns from the Chinese banks concerning compliance with Chinese law. So while the Court of Appeals noted that it was a close call, it ultimately held that the American national security interests surrounding North Korea's nuclear program and the limitations on the MLAA process outweighed those comity concerns. So, you know, when you look at the three Chinese bank case from 2019, the government, the DOJ, was placed in a pretty good posture. They got a ruling that they got the court to say that the law is what the DOJ wants the law to be. But it does bear some mention, you know, when you're strategically considering these types of subpoenas, that each case is based on a unique set of facts, and a court may not always side with the Department of Justice. So, for example, if a client gets a subpoena, you know, we regularly advise them to talk to the government about the subpoena and try and negotiate its scope, because the posture of these types of subpoenas is not good for anyone. Obviously, the banks are feeling squeezed by the subpoena. The foreign authorities are not thrilled by the United States government trying to collect documents overseas through the U.S. court system. And frankly, the DOJ, when they issue the subpoena, and it requires some degree of approval within DOJ to even get the subpoena in the first place, the DOJ doesn't know whether it's going to get a fight from a bank when they issue the subpoena. And as I mentioned, it's a case-by-case, fact-specific analysis. And DOJ could lose some of these cases and create some bad law for themselves. So they're not looking for a fight either. But nonetheless, it just gives you a sense of the aggressiveness that the DOJ is willing to assert itself by issuing these types of subpoenas.
So, Mike, to sum up the current state of affairs, when the Department of Justice is looking to collect evidence from overseas, and China's an example, but it's not the only jurisdiction that the DOJ seeks evidence from. It's really got a couple of mechanisms. It can go through the MLA agreement and rely upon the Chinese to respond. And they've found that has been an unsuccessful route in many cases. And in fact, I think in the three Chinese bank subpoena case, they indicated that they had only received responses in the past 10 years on 50 MLA requests. They'd received 15 responses, and some of them were not, did not produce records that could be admitted in court. So the department has found that approach to be unsuccessful. And then, so then it has to fall back on these two types of subpoenas, Bank of Nova Scotia subpoena and a Patriot Act subpoena. And as you pointed out, it leaves everybody in an unsatisfactory position. Banks, of course, are very uncomfortable being squeezed between the US government and inevitably a regulator or government agencies at home who are not happy that the US government is reaching into their jurisdiction to take records. So you've got regulators there who are unhappy, and then the Department of Justice also views this as a risky gambit because they know that they're uncorking diplomatic issues. They also could get a fight in court, and they could lose. And because it's a fact-based inquiry, they're exposed themselves, and their powers could be weakened if they brought the wrong case to court. So that's really the current posture today. I would note that the scope of these subpoenas oftentimes can be negotiated with regulators, foreign regulators, and the Department of Justice, and it is possible to come to agreement on what can be produced from overseas in a way that leaves everybody at least satisfied with the result and nobody exposed and at risk. But it's just a situation that is not good for banks, and it's not good for law enforcement in the United States. So what we have coming down the pipeline, which brings us to this topic today, is the National Defense Authorization Act, which has some anti-money laundering provisions in it, including a subpoena provision. And I think before we start talking about the subpoena provision of that act, I think we should turn to Michael Borden and ask Michael to give us a quick update on where this legislation stands.
Tim, the National Defense Authorization Act is a bipartisan bill to fund the military that's passed Congress every year for the last 60 years. It passed the House and the Senate overwhelmingly a couple of weeks ago, and now it's waiting for the president's signature. The president, though, as for multiple reasons, some of which are relevant and some of which seem to be just picked out of thin air, is threatening to veto the bill. And actually, just before we got on this webinar, he tweeted, "I will veto the defense bill, which will make China very unhappy. They love it. Must have Section 230 termination, protect our national monuments, and allow for removal of military from far away and very unappreciative lands. Thank you," Trump tweeted. And so, normally this would be something pretty simple, and we could count on the National Defense Authorization Act to pass, essentially, there's always significant negotiations, but will pass overwhelmingly. This time, it's unclear. You have the Senate elections, less than about 3 weeks away, and President Trump has not had any of his vetoes overridden in his 4 years. This would be the first. While the Congress seems prepared to do it, his threat of a veto and now attaching it to China policy seems like a way to try to trap Democrats into looking like they are soft on China, even though there's almost no evidence in the bill that this is a bill that's soft on China in any way.
So, and Michael, what happens if the bill either is not signed or he vetoes it, at the end of the administration in January?
So he has until I think it's December 23rd to veto or sign the bill into law. Congress then has the opportunity before this Congress ends to override the veto, which requires 2/3 of both the House and the Senate. Based on the first vote, they could do that. The question is whether the Republicans in Congress will choose to override the president on such a high-profile matter at the end of his term and right before a Senate election. Should it not pass at the end of this year, it would be the first time, like I mentioned, in 60 years. The military wouldn't get a pay raise. You would think that it would be politically unpopular. However, it wouldn't necessarily mean that this bill disappears and goes away. I think what you'd find is the same people who negotiated this bill would work to quickly pass the NDAA pretty close after Joe Biden has been sworn into office, and we would see this bill pass in late January.
Great. So I guess with the very strong caveat that this is not law, and while we thought there was a high likelihood it would become law imminently, it now looks like it's caught up in the world of Donald Trump's machinations, and so it's a little less clear now whether it will become law. But nevertheless, I think it's worth talking about some of the provisions of the act because they're relevant for our discussion today, and there is a good chance that they will become law in the near future. So in the first, turning back to Michael Mann, the most important, for purposes of this discussion, the most important aspect of the anti-money laundering law of 2020 is the subpoena provision. Mike, do you want to take a crack at describing that to us?
Sure. And, look, it's a pretty broad bill, as everybody watching this probably is aware. And so there's a lot of moving parts to it. But with respect to the subpoena component to it, the NDAA, among other things, would expand the power of Treasury or the Department of Justice to subpoena any foreign bank with the correspondent bank account in the United States. And it would not only allow the subpoena to be made, but it would restrict the ability of foreign banks to even claim foreign secrecy or confidentiality laws prohibit compliance with that subpoena. It would also set fine amounts for foreign banks who fail to keep the subpoenas confidential by setting fines at either double the criminal proceeds moving through the bank, whatever number that is, or how they calculate that number, or a $250,000 fine if there's no criminal proceeds that were moving through the bank. And not only that, but the bank would be forced to end the correspondent relationship within 10 days after notice from the U.S. government that a foreign bank failed to comply with the subpoena. So it'd be, it wouldn't be tremendously different than the outcome in the 3 Chinese bank case that I just referred to earlier, but this would memorialize it in law. It would, and it would have some pretty swift consequences for failure to comply, whereas in the other case, at least there were some arguments that could be marshaled before a judge who would have an ability to consider the DOJ's subpoena and some of the comedy concerns. This would effectively extinguish many of those arguments.
Well, Mike, let me take a crack at sort of characterizing the subpoena provision, because the way I look at it is it's really a Patriot Act subpoena on steroids. It's directed at foreign banks that have correspondent accounts in the United States. And instead of just being subject to producing as it is under the Patriot Act, to producing evidence that relates to the correspondent account, the provisions of the new subpoena provision would allow the Department of Justice or the Treasury to obtain records related to any account. And so long as the transaction is related to a violation of the criminal laws or violation of the Bank Secrecy Act, or a couple of categories which are fairly significant categories. So the evidence that could be obtained is much broader. And then in addition, the law, as you've indicated, makes it basically states that the confidentiality or bank secrecy requirements of the foreign jurisdiction alone cannot stand in the way of satisfaction of a subpoena. So I suppose it means that that can be argued in combination with other factors in court in an effort to quash such a subpoena. But the statute says that standing alone, confidentiality and secrecy requirements cannot block satisfaction of a subpoena. Also, the financial institution providing correspondent banking services in the United States has to maintain certain records related to their customers who have correspondent bank accounts in the U.S. and produce them in response to subpoena within 7 days. And then there are all kinds of penalties for noncompliance, including the foreign financial institution will lose their ability to bank through the United States if they don't satisfy the subpoena requirements. So they're very significant. And I would note that the bill also includes provisions that in which the Treasury Department has programs in place designed to educate and obtain collaboration from foreign governments in combating money laundering. And so I would expect that the effort, if this passes, the effort within the Treasury Department would be to educate and get cooperation from foreign jurisdictions and to help educate folks that the United States, really in exchange for allowing foreign banks to access the U.S. financial system through correspondent bank accounts, is going to have to produce discovery. I doubt that's going to be very popular in a lot of jurisdictions, but that's what's going on here. And, it has the potential to make the Department of Justice's efforts to obtain evidence overseas much stronger. And I expect we'll see if the legislation passes or is signed, we will see an increase in requests, and we will get to see how foreign governments react to these requests. I'd also note a couple of other provisions of the National Defense Authorization Act that I think folks should be very aware of, and that is the beneficial owner provisions. It's been a huge challenge for banks to, in some circumstances, to find out who the beneficial owners are of entities that are holding accounts at their institutions. Customer due diligence efforts have been very significant, expensive, and frustrating for banks. This new legislation would require FinCEN to start collecting and keeping a database of beneficial owner information for both U.S. companies and foreign companies that are registered in the United States. There are a whole bunch of exclusions in categories that one would expect, like public companies or companies in regulated industries. But shell companies are certainly going to have to provide beneficial owner information to FinCEN. It takes the obligation in some ways away from the banks and the risk away from the banks and puts it in the hands of the government. Obviously, there are still customer due diligence requirements will be in place for banks, but FinCEN's been directed to consider whether those obligations should be lightened in light of the creation of the FinCEN database. And then lastly, there's a whistleblower provision. And so this legislation would create a whistleblower program, much like is in place for securities violations, where whistleblowers could obtain an award in response for providing original information that leads to monetary sanctions against a party. And so that could cause more, increase in allegations both within banks and outside of banks about violations of the money laundering laws and could lead to additional investigations. But overall, the statute appears to be, the legislation, if passed, appears to be a big victory for banks and for law enforcement, frankly, in the United States, and is something that folks should keep their eyes on, especially given the issues around whether it will be signed by the president, and if not, if it'll be included in the Defense Authorization Act that is considered by the Biden administration inevitably during its early days. So let's turn to the second aspect of our presentation, and that is economic sanctions targeting China. And so there's a lot going on in this area, a huge amount, actually. Really every day there's something in the news that relates to economic sanctions in China. I think the first thing we should do is turn to Barbara, who has been very patient. Barbara, ask you to give us a sense of some of the things that have been going on related to China in the area of economic sanctions.
Sure, Tim. I think the better question is what hasn't been going on in respect to China in the field of economic sanctions lately. As you can see from the slide on the screen right now, it's not just an executive function at the moment. Both Congress and the president have been very active in the China area for trade legislation, both on economic sanctions and on the more traditional trade aspects of customs and export controls. There's a couple of the recently enacted laws that we'll be discussing in a bit more detail later, the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act, the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, and the National Defense Authorization Act of 2018, so not the one we were just discussing. There's pending legislation, including additional legislation on forced labor and additional provisions in the NDAA that we were just discussing. If we can go on to the trade actions. So this is just sort of a quick summary of things that have happened almost in the last year or two, although the 301 tariffs have been around longer for that, with respect to US government actions related to China. And sort of some of these are more traditional trade that might not be as significant for a bank from a perspective of what a bank might be doing itself, but are relevant to understanding what your clients and customers are facing and where your clients and customers may create risk for you. Since it's also important because, as we listened to Mike Mann talk about earlier, the US government subpoenaing banks for information on what their customers are up to try and get information on things like trade with North Korea, or what we'll see in enforcement settings where the US government is going after banks for facilitating activity that may violate other sanctions programs. It's also important to keep in mind because the government has been extraordinarily coordinated on all of these efforts. So, for example, if we look at some of the most recent customs actions, obviously we're all well aware of the 301 tariffs, which are the additional tariffs on goods from China. But there's also withhold release orders, which are what prohibit importation of goods that are allegedly made with forced labor into the United States. And in general, US law prohibits any goods made by forced labor from importation. But if the government has evidence or believes it has evidence that specific goods are made with forced labor, it can also issue withhold release orders, which allows the government to seize the goods at the border. The US government just released a very large one targeting XPCC's, Xinjiang Production Construction Company Cotton. That makes up approximately, I think it's around 30% of Chinese cotton, and Chinese cotton makes up 20% of the US cotton. So that's any t-shirt, or you buy it from XPCC or some vendor in Italy, would be covered by that. And what makes it so significant in the landscape is that that came within days of a general license expiring with respect to sanctions on XPCC. So it's clear the government is very coordinated in these efforts. They've admitted that coordination. And so what you may see one day as a customs issue could be a sanctions issue the next day, or what's an export issue one day as a customs issue the next day. So it's really important to keep abreast of all the various areas of trade where the government is acting, because they easily flow from one to another. On the export side, in the last 2 years, we've seen additions to the military end user rules, which are heavily focused on China, Russia, Venezuela. Entity list designations, again, tied to the Xinjiang region and China more generally. Changes to the laws to treat Hong Kong as China for export control purposes, whereas previously Hong Kong had much more lenient export control restrictions than China. And then on the sanction side, like we just discussed, there's been legislative movement and executive movement. So we'll talk in a minute about the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, but in addition to that, the president also signed an executive order allowing the government even more authority for the designation of particular entities, individuals, and financial institutions that support those. There's investment sanctions on what the government terms communist Chinese military companies. There's the Global Magnitsky Program, which OFAC has viewed as a very effective tool as of late that it's using in broad applications. So Global Magnitsky sanctions generally allow OFAC to target what it considers alleged human rights abusers. But that's not tied to any particular country program the way a lot of sanctions programs work. So OFAC has really taken advantage of it for any area where it sees potential human rights and national security risk, regardless of potential ties to geography. So it's used Global Magnitsky sanctions to get at alleged human rights abusers in China, such as XPCC, which we were just discussing a minute ago. And then it's important to keep in mind that when you're talking about China, you're not just government actions against China. You're not just talking about government actions targeted at China. Like we mentioned, Global Magnitsky is a very broad program. But there's a number of Chinese actors sanctioned under different sanctions programs. So the government is really leveraging every tool in its belt in this area. So it's important to think about these issues more holistically. So if we look at the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, you really have to look at that with the Executive Order 13936 because they get at very similar ideas. But the goal is that the US government believes China has infringed on the autonomy of Hong Kong. And in so doing, the government has set out a number of mechanisms to sort of counteract that from its perspective. So with the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, Congress directed the various executive agencies to take certain actions. The first, and it's sort of a multi-part process. The first part is the State Department has been directed to issue a report on parties that should be designated under the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, which is really parties that materially contribute to the contravention of Hong Kong's autonomy. And it's a very broad statement. And then from that report, OFAC is supposed to report on parties, on foreign financial institutions that engage in significant transactions on behalf of the parties listed by the State Department. And then flowing from those reports is sort of the final step, which is what does this actually mean, which are the sanctions that can be imposed on foreign financial institutions if they do engage in significant transactions on behalf of the listed parties. And those can range from a number of things. If you're on the list for 1 year, it's mandatory 5 sanctions of the menu-based sanctions. If you're on the list for 2 years, it's all 10. This is everything from limitations on US loans to designation as an SDN yourself. So this is meant as a deterrent effect to keep foreign financial institutions from choosing to bank listed parties. But it does create significant risk if foreign financial institutions choose to go forward in that respect. Now that list just came out from OFAC, and despite the State Department's designations of 10 individuals and OFAC sanctioning of those individuals, OFAC has chosen not to report any foreign financial institutions as having engaged in significant transactions for those individuals.
And Barbara, that's an ongoing reporting requirement. So while no financial institutions have been reported as of yet, is it possible that financial institutions could be reported in the future?
Yes, and that's a really good point. Something that people may have seen Monday that sort of slid in under the radar was actually the designation of some Turkish government entities and individuals. And these were for arms sales from Russia that Turkey did 1.5 years ago. And when those occurred, there was sort of question in the sanctions world if these would result in sanctions under CAATSA, because CAATSA is the Countering American Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. And that was passed in October of 2017 and includes what's known as mandatory secondary sanctions. So if a party meets the terms in the act, OFAC is supposedly required to designate them. There was a general feeling in the industry that Turkey's purchase of arms from Russia should meet any definition that was used by the government in interpreting what is a significant transaction. But yet we didn't see any secondary sanctions come. But now here we are 1.5 years later, and they came out on Monday. So I think it's important to remember that just because we haven't seen any yet doesn't mean we won't see them later.
So Michael Borden, let's turn to the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so just as one point of a transition that I think is important to mention is that there is a lot of people are hoping and expecting that once January 20th comes and Joe Biden's sworn in as president, that all of this is going to change. And I think that it's important to note that almost all of these legislative steps that have been taken have passed either almost unanimously or with overwhelming bipartisan margins. No one in the Congress wants to be seen as quote unquote soft on China. And so there is a bipartisan consensus actually to push forward with these punitive steps towards China, Chinese companies, and Chinese individuals. And part of that happened also this summer with the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act, a bill that many people expected to just remain dormant this Congress and no one anticipated was going to pass. Instead, it passed through the process of unanimous consent in the Senate and then passed in the House unanimously as well. And it would require the SEC to identify issuers of U.S. securities, or of securities on U.S. securities exchanges, that issue audit reports prepared by registered public accounting firms with offices located in foreign jurisdictions, and fail to allow the PCAOB to conduct an audit of the reports prepared by the accounting firm because of a position taken by an authority within the foreign jurisdiction. While this has broad applicability, it was clearly designed to target China and companies that operate in China. So what will happen fundamentally is that if the PCAOB is unable to completely, which is a key word here, to completely conduct an audit of the audit documents, that would require after 3 years the delisting from U.S. securities exchanges of their securities. Now, the legislation requires the SEC to issue rules outlining the procedures for submitting the disclosures and what's required within 90 days. And we still haven't seen those rules passed or enacted yet. However, what this really does mean is that Congress has kicked this issue down, kicked it down the curb for another 3 years, because no one will be delisted immediately. You'll have 3 years from the point of identification. And I think that many people in Congress believe that over time, there will be some way to negotiate with the Chinese government to provide more transparency to the audit reports. However, there's a key, there was, when the bill passed in the House, Congressman Sherman, who was the lead sponsor of the bill, read a joint statement that he had prepared with the Senate sponsor of the bill, Senator John Kennedy from Louisiana, which was an attempt to read in a congressional interpretation that provides the SEC more flexibility and discretion than the SEC is actually given in the law itself. Whether that'll be adopted or not, it really does remain to be seen. And it's unclear whether the SEC is going to follow the principles that Congressman Sherman outlined in the joint statement. But so this is an issue that will be ongoing and likely negotiated over the next 3 years. And perhaps requires some sort of a fix. So it's something to be mindful of and to stay engaged with, because now you have a rulemaking process at the SEC with Congress suggesting that the SEC be more flexible than the law actually says it should be.
Great, thanks, Michael. So moving right along, Barbara, can you address for us the Chinese military company sanctions that we all learned about in the last couple of weeks?
Sure. So these came out in November, and they're considered investment sanctions. It's important to keep in mind that these sanctions, unlike a lot of the U.S. sanctions programs, are not comprehensive. So the parties subject to and targeted by this list are not comprehensively blocked by the U.S. government in a way people think about with SDNs. So specially designated nationals, or SDNs, are parties that almost all business subject to U.S. jurisdiction is prohibited. This is a very specific listing, and we started to see sanctions like this back with the Russia and Ukraine related sanctions in 2014, where there's sort of a middle ground of certain restrictions are put on a specific list of parties. And that's what we see with the investment sanctions on the Chinese military companies. So these were released in November. They become effective January 11th, 2021. And OFAC has consistently promised that sometime we will see guidance for giving us further information on how they intend to interpret this. This is something that, as of last week, OFAC still promised is coming. They said it maybe 3 or 4 times in a conference they were speaking at last week. So it is something that we should expect, but it's not clear that we're going to see it before January 11th. By which point we'll already have seen the market react to its own interpretations of these sanctions. So it's a very limited, targeted prohibition, which is transactions by U.S. persons, so not even as broad as most sanctions, which is by U.S. persons or within the United States, but transactions by U.S. persons in publicly traded securities, and then this is where things get interesting, or any securities that are derivative thereof or designed to provide investment exposure to such securities of the designated Chinese military companies. And this is sort of, in quotes, communist Chinese military companies. And there's 3 ways you can become such. Either the company has already been designated by the Department of Defense as such, the Department of Defense later designates the party as such, or Treasury designates the party as such, or as a subsidiary of such. So the latter part is actually fairly interesting and is where a lot of questions on this issue are coming, which is, do these restrictions only apply to the listed entities, or do they also apply to subsidiaries and affiliates? Now, if you're to read the executive order and you're to say, well, if Treasury is allowed to designate for purposes of this order subsidiaries of the listed companies, you would assume that that means the listed companies are exclusive and don't include subsidiaries or affiliates. However, some of the parties on the lists are used as sort of brand names and they're not entity specific. So there's some idea that if it's not one entity, it must be all entities. And then the State Department actually issued what they called a fact sheet last week, where they listed not just the entities, but affiliate and subsidiary entities that are currently listed as with publicly traded securities. So they did throw a little bit of ambiguity onto that phrase that hopefully in whatever guidance OFAC is pushing out, we'll see some clarity on, because that's a significant difference for a lot of these companies, whether it's just targeting the listed entity or its subsidiaries and affiliates. The other thing is the potential extent to which these could apply. And that's in the language of the design to provide an investment exposure to such securities, which there's a lot of thought right now in the industry means it also includes indices and ETFs. Because if there is one of these in a fund, then presumably then that fund provides exposure to such securities and could therefore mean that these restrictions would apply to even broader scopes.
So Barbara, if you're a bank, how are you supposed to think about sanctions like these? I mean, obviously having a relationship or having commercial interactions with the entities who have been designated is not completely impermissible. It's limited to securities transactions. So, I mean, what if a bank is processing payments related to a securities transaction or financing a securities transaction? Does the executive order give enough guidance on that, or is this the kind of thing we should be waiting for OFAC's guidance?
Unfortunately, this is an area where we're going to have to wait for OFAC's guidance. The executive order prohibits evading, avoiding, and conspiracy with respect to any of these sanctions, but it's silent on what the US traditionally calls facilitation, which is somebody that sort of sits as an intermediary in a transaction like this. So that's read into most OFAC sanctions, so it would not be unheard of for us to see that sort of activity covered. But there's unfortunately insufficient information in the executive order for us to know if OFAC's going to read that in here. And hopefully that will be part of what we see in the guidance. That's part of what practitioners in the industry have requested OFAC to give guidance on, that the subsidiary issue and the index issue are sort of the top three outstanding questions. And unfortunately, I think if we don't see that guidance soon enough, we'll see a lot of self-censorship in that respect. And we're going to start to see the market react to the most conservative interpretations.
Right, makes sense. So we're coming up on the sort of last aspect of our presentation, and this is the one that I've been looking forward to the most. It's when we ask Michael Borden to take out his crystal ball, use his vast experience observing the behavior of politicians, and to give us a sense of what you expect in the next 34 days from the Trump administration, and then after that, what types of signs have we seen that can give us some guidance on how the Biden administration may handle things?
So Tim, the way you asked that first question is really, it's I think a really astute way of asking it, because for the next 34 days, Donald Trump isn't going to quit. He's still the president of the United States until January 20th. And China policy remains really a centerpiece of everything he does, from now framing the potential veto of the NDAA for being insufficiently harsh on China. I think that he's going to move back to sort of the position he's taken over the last 6 months, which was someone in his administration and someone in his campaign told me back in late June to expect every 3 to 4 days an announcement of punitive actions against China, Chinese individuals, or Chinese companies. And it proved to be absolutely true. Like clockwork, we saw over the course of that, through the campaign, we saw an announcement every 3 or 4 days of new steps against China. Some of these came legislatively, but many of these were administrative. And I think that in these next 34 days, we're going to continue to see the president try to show how tough he is on China as a way of trying to set a contrast with what he's going to try to position the Biden administration is soft on China. You know, what we've seen so far just since the election, a lot of the issues that Barbara's described, expansions of the communist Chinese military company list and actually beyond just the list, sanctions of those institutions, the leak of a potential military end user list, attempts to, like I said, punish China or target China through the NDAA. I think that we should expect that he's going to be seeking big headlines between now and January 20th as a way to punish China for whatever has animated the hostility towards China over the last 4 years, whether it was a concern that China wasn't playing fair with trade, China was a violator of human rights, China was spreading a virus, destroying a global economy, whatever grievance he has seen. And it's been an attempt or a rationalization for this policy. And I think that what we should expect is there are a series of announcements, some which might have more bark than bite. But I wouldn't be surprised to see him target large Chinese institutions for the sake of a big headline. As I mentioned earlier, and we have here a tweet that I posted on this slide. This was a previous tweet from the weekend saying that he was going to veto the defense bill, and he continues to stick to this message. So I think we're going to see a series of actions against, or there will be a series of headlines with President Trump seeking to target China and Chinese institutions, which then takes us to January 20th. What happens when Joe Biden becomes the president? And we can really just sort of look, he hasn't said much, but he did an interview with Thomas Friedman in the New York Times, which we've excerpted here on this slide, where he's tried to discuss what his China strategy would be and how it would be different from President Trump's. And I think most importantly is that it's not, at least at first, seemingly going to be very different from President Trump's. He said that he's not going to immediately act to remove the tariffs that President Trump imposed on Chinese imports. He said he's not going to the quote is, "I'm not going to make any immediate moves." And the same, because I'm not going to prejudice my options. So now, in sort of a Trumpian way, President-elect Biden sees leverage, and he's seeking leverage to try to get concessions from China and Chinese companies. And I think that what President Biden will do as president is he will seek to assemble global coalitions similar to what the U.S. has done under President Trump as it's targeted Huawei overseas and sought to decouple the U.S. or the international telecommunications network from Chinese companies. And I think that you'll see more work like that in the Biden administration as he seeks to build an international coalition of the West against China. But I think that you'll see the rhetoric's going to change. I don't think you're going to have the identification of individual companies in the same way as you've seen under President Trump. But I don't think that in any way we should expect in the immediate term or in the intermediate term to see really significant changes. And I don't think that President Biden will set as a goal necessarily fundamentally changing Chinese government policies. But I do think that for Chinese companies and Chinese institutions that want to have a global presence, there will be a lot of pressure to adopt more Western norms and corporate norms. And so there will be a lot of pressure imposed on companies to follow sort of the Western approach to corporate governance, human rights, and other issues.
Excellent, Michael. Well, we have time, I think. Well, we're right at the end. We have one question pending that relates to whether we think the DOJ will use the subpoena provision, the NDAA, in a limited manner, and if regulations will issue. No, there will be no regulations. DOJ doesn't typically issue regulations around their use of subpoenas. They use their discretion. They have internal policies around what approvals they need to get. So I expect there'll be approvals required for such subpoenas. Will they use them in a limited manner? I do believe so. I think that some of the same diplomatic issues are in play that have caused limited use of Patriot Act and Bank of Nova Scotia subpoenas. But due to the broader ability to use those subpoenas to get at evidence in criminal cases, I think there'll be an increased use of the subpoenas if this act is signed into law. But I don't think that we will see them being issued the way we see grand jury subpoenas being issued domestically. So I think that brings us to a close. So thanks, everybody. Bridget, thank you so much for hosting us. We very much appreciate the opportunity on a snowy day to talk to everybody. I think you're on mute.
Thank you. This was just great. I'm thinking, like, given the dearth of sports, maybe we should have a little side thing going for bets on whether the president's veto will be overridden. But again, thank you. Thanks everyone that attended. Thank you so much, Tim, Michael, and Barbara. This was just great. And we, as always, we really appreciate that you targeted your presentation to the issues that really, are of interest and relevance to the international banks and their customers. So thank you. Thanks for entertaining questions. We hope everyone has happy holidays and stay tuned. I'm pretty sure we're going to be asking you back, in a couple of weeks or months to see your view on how the terrain might or maybe will change. So thanks.
Super. Thanks, Bridget. We appreciate the collaboration. Happy holidays, everybody.